Welcome back. All right, so an age-old discussion when it comes to the National Hockey League. This is nothing new. Which conference is stronger? And I remember back in the 90s, at the height of Detroit and Colorado, once the Abs were the Abs and no longer the Quebec Nordiques, the West was definitely the stronger of the two. And there was that conversation about, hey, so the conference final is the real Stanley Cup final in the West, right? So over the years, it's gone back and forth. And I feel like at this point in time, you could make the argument for the West being the stronger of the two conferences. Although, to be honest, I think it's really close. I do. I think it's really close. I think there are some teams that aren't playing as well as they can. And I think there are some teams that are just playing amazingly well right now. And so I think that skews the numbers a little bit. It does appear that you're going to need more points to make the playoffs in the West than in the East. And that's where people say, well, there's more bad teams in the West. But I don't feel like that's necessarily going to explain this large point difference when teams, the most times you play any one team in a season is 4 games. The fewest amount of times you can play a team in the league is twice. So it is not a huge difference if you're saying that Chicago and San Jose are clearly worse than absolutely everybody else. It's really not that huge of a difference. And then in the East, you have some weak teams as well right now. So I've got this organized by division, as you can tell. I've got 9 teams in the East and 8 in the West. I feel like the West is pretty much settled, right? Mathematically, other teams are still alive, but the 8 teams on the board are very likely to be the 8 teams in the playoffs. In the East, there's still other teams that are close, but since Montreal and the Rangers are tied in points, I figured I'd put both of them on the board. So we go to the Atlantic, and we may have 5 Atlantic teams and 3 Metro teams, which shows that division strength has changed as well. It's not that long ago the Metro was clearly the top division from 1 through 8, and now it doesn't seem to be quite as strong as it was. Now, Toronto's leading the Atlantic, 94 points in 74 games. And one thing to look at is that it looks like it'll take fewer points to win the Atlantic than it will to win other divisions. So for Toronto, the 94 points in 74 games is excellent. 26, 15, and 1 against the East. They are 19, 10, and 3 against the West. So their winning percentage against the West and the East is very similar. And so for Toronto, I don't think that it shows that there's much of a difference in terms of strength between the East and the West. And then you got Tampa, 73 games, 91 points. So this fight for the division is going to go right down to the wire between Toronto, Tampa, and Florida. Tampa Bay against the East, 23, 13, and 5. Against the West, 20, 12, and 0. So very similar records there. Florida, 73 games, 91 points. Record of 23, 16, and 2 against the East. 21, 10, and 1 against the West. And we know what we can expect from Florida come playoff time. Likely, they will be the toughest out in the playoff. Likely. Not meaning that it's definite, just as likely they'll be the toughest team to eliminate in the East. And then you got Ottawa. Now, what I like with Ottawa is they've got 73 games, 84 points, and there's no expectations on Ottawa, really. Like, they're in that area of just happy to be back in the playoffs. And that could be dangerous come playoff time, not having that same amount of pressure. So in the event that they end up being, say, the number 1 wild card and going against Toronto, if Toronto wins the division and if they play Ottawa, could we see an upset there? Ottawa against the East, 21, 16, and 5. Against the West, 18, 12, and 1. So a little better record against the West than against the East for Ottawa. Same could be said with Florida as well. And with Toronto and Tampa, about the same. Then you got Montreal. Montreal, 77 points in 73 games. So they got 1 fewer game played than do the New York Rangers. Against the East, the Montreal Canadiens, 22, 18, and 3. Against the West, 12, 12, and 6. So Montreal's had more struggles against the Western teams than they have against teams in the East. And I'm not 100% surprised by that. And one thing to keep in mind is when you're going back and forth between the conferences, there's the time difference. And I think people gloss over that a little bit. But when you're going from playing in the Eastern time zone to playing in California, coming up playing against Vancouver and Seattle, that's a 3-hour time difference. It's a huge difference. So those are your 5 teams in the Atlantic. Then we get to the Metro, leading the way, the Capitals, 103 points in 73 games. So they're 9 points clear of both Toronto, who are the number 1 team in the Atlantic, and 9 points clear of Carolina in the Metro. So, yeah, Washington's going to be the number 1 seed in the East. 29, 9, and 4 record against the East, 18, 8, and 5 record against the West. Very similar records against both conferences. Although their record against the East, I think the points percentage is higher against the East than against the West. Carolina, 73 games, 94 points, a record of 26-12-4 against the East, 19-12-1 against the West. And I've talked about over the last couple of years, at times Carolina struggled against Western Conference teams, and that road trip through the West has been tough for them over the last couple of years. New Jersey, 75 games, 85 points, record of 24-14-6 against the East, 15-15-1 against the West. They do not play as well against the West as they do against the East, and it is just one of those curiosities with the New Jersey Devils, and there are other curiosities as well, but that's one of them. New York Rangers, 77 points in 74 games against the East. They have the same record as Montreal, 22-18-3 against the West, 13-14-4. So they're below 500 against the West. They're above 500 against the East. So I think that lends itself to the idea that at the very least, the conferences now look even, right? And I mean, of the teams on the board, it is interesting. If we go over this here, which is Stanley Cup champions, you can see Tampa's on the board for that. Florida's on the board for that. Capitals are on the board for that as to being Stanley Cup champions over the last decade. So we go out west. And when we go out west, Winnipeg is leading the way. 74 games, 106 points. Against the East, they're 23-8-1. Against the West, 28-11-3. So that's what, 5-3-2 in those extra games against the West over the East. It's similar. Then you go to Dallas, 75 games, 100 points for Dallas, 18-11-1 record against the East, and a 30-10-3 record against the West. Dallas definitely likes playing Western opponents more than the East, and we'll see in the playoffs how that affects things, right? Because you're obviously playing Western teams in the playoffs right up until Stanley Cup final. Now, Colorado, 93 points in 74 games. Against the East, they're 20-10-1. Against the West, 25-16-2. So, Colorado better against the East than they are against Western Conference foes, which would include the aforementioned San Jose Sharks, Chicago Blackhawks, and any other lower-rated Western team that one wants to throw in there. And then 87 points is the cutoff. So, what's interesting is 87 points being the cutoff in the West would rule out the Rangers by a mile. Montreal wouldn't be anywhere near, and it would be ahead of Ottawa. In fact, it would also be ahead of New Jersey. So the West looks strong. Minnesota, 74 games, 87 points against the East, 28-1. They love playing against the East, struggles against the West, 21-20-4. So definitely a tougher time against Western opponents than Eastern. Which means that what I said about Dallas, the opposite's true for Minnesota. Minnesota would have a very hard time getting through the West. Maybe they'd have a better time in the Stanley Cup final than they would in the other series preceding it. St. Louis, 74 games, 87 points. They do not do well against the East. 13-14-3, but they do very well against the West. 27-14-4. So, love playing against Western teams. Bit more struggle against the Eastern teams. And this is the beauty of this. When you have the parity, that's how that's going to work. So those are the 5 teams in the Central. I think if we're going to go ahead and say, well, let's rate divisions, I think the Central is the toughest division right now in the National Hockey League. I would probably put the Atlantic at second, the Metro at third, and I will agree that the Pacific is fourth, but it's going to get better, and the Pacific may not be fourth for much longer. So Vegas leads the Pacific Division, 98 points in 73 games. So if we're looking at division leaders, Winnipeg has 106, Washington 103, Vegas 98, and Toronto 94. Now against the East, Vegas 16-12-4. They've struggled against the East. It's something I've talked about in videos not too long ago. And against the West, Vegas 29-8-4. So they do very well against Western opponents. And it does not bode well for whoever they play in the first round. Although, if they get St. Louis, if St. Louis beats Minnesota for this spot, if St. Louis is the number one wild card and they get a shot at Vegas, that could be a fantastic... That's the series that I think could be amazing. I really do. I think that could be just 7 games. Yep, I think that would go 7 games. And it could be a lot of fun. And then that sets up Winnipeg, Minnesota. The LA Kings, 73 games, 91 points. So 2 points ahead of Edmonton at this point in time. Against the East, they're 19-9-4. Against the West, tougher record, 22-14-5. So Definitely better against the East, I think, than against the West. They're 10 games above 500 against the East, 8 games above 500 against the West, more games played against the West. And so there you go. Now, of course, with LA, we could also talk about the fact they have the best home record in the NHL, but that might be more of a, when we're getting closer to the playoffs, and I do want to talk about team strengths and weaknesses once we get closer to said playoffs and we know for sure about some of the injuries. For instance, like with Matthew Tkachuk, like with Kaprizov and Eriksson Ek, and then Landeskog being the big one for Colorado. Then you got the Edmonton Oilers, 73 games, 89 points. Against the East, a record of 16, 13, and 3, so not fantastic against the East. Against the West, 26, 13, and 2. So Edmonton, a better record against the West than against the East, and it looks like they should and could be starting the playoffs on the road against the LA Kings, and that's difficult. Now, one thing to look at, and one thing that I've always said is, well, hey, you know, this conference may very well be just as strong as the other, and I mean the West may be as strong as the East because of Stanley Cup champions. The detractors have said, well, but they have an easier time getting there. And I've never heard a hockey player in my life say, I'm really glad we were in this conference because, boy, was it easy getting to the Stanley Cup final. So if we go back over the last 10 Stanley Cup champions prior to this season, because we don't know the Stanley Cup champion yet. Chicago was champion in 2015, so that's West. And then it's in the East for 3 years. Pittsburgh in 2016 and 2017. Washington in 2018. St. Louis wins it in 2019, so it's a Western team's property just for the 1 year. And then Tampa wins it in 2020 and 2021. So 5 out of 6 seasons, the East wins, which lends itself to this idea that the East is a stronger conference. However, 2022 Colorado wins it. 2023 Vegas wins it. Last year Florida won it for the first time. So overall on this board, yes, the East's won more Stanley Cups. However, the West has won 2 of the last 3. And I wouldn't rule out a Western champion this time around either. But the question becomes one of, so which logo on this board is most likely to end up being the logo of the Stanley Cup champions? And I think an argument can be made. Before the season started, I picked Dallas. We'll see when the playoffs start if Dallas is still my pick. I honestly, at this point, think, why not? Why should I change other than just for the sake of changing it? But I may, once we get to the start of the playoffs. But there are real true contenders, I think, in the East and in the West. And it should make for a very fun playoffs. But I don't think there's a huge difference between the two conferences in terms of the strength of the teams. But there's definitely some other video things that I could do between now and the start of the playoffs where we can have that discussion. Maybe a comparison head-to-head of teams 1 through 8 in each conference. Once we know who's making it for sure in the East, which might take until about 5 minutes before the actual first round gets started. But hey, makes for more fun down the stretch, doesn't it? Let me know your thoughts. Which conference do you think is stronger, or do you think we have parity now? And so each conference is equally good. Let me know your thoughts. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't already done so. Thank you guys so much for all your support as always. I will talk to you again soon.